Tonight is really about the qualitative method of conducting personal interviews. And what I'm going to do is talk about not only what really an interview is, what it means, as a research tool or as a method, but also how do we um, establish, how do we set up, how do we structure an interview to get the most value from our respondents? What's always going to be important for us is that during an interview, we build trust, and ultimately we get a completed interview with our respondent. So we've got a full set of data that we can then work with, and hopefully many interviews as well, but at least making sure that we get a complete set of data. Tonight, it's very much an introductory webinar, but I'm hoping that what we put through or what we talk about tonight will certainly give you enough to really get started. If you want to go deeper, we do have a boot camp coming up that is 2 solid days looking at how we conduct personal interviews and everything that goes into it. But tonight will certainly give you a good start. I have 3 very simple objectives tonight. I want to understand the principles of conducting interviews for research. I want to understand best practice roles and activities for the interviewer. So how can you as the interviewer be the most engaging, the most appropriate, the most contextually appropriate for your respondents? And finally, how do I understand how to design both questions and the discussion flow for maximum usable output? And, it sounds like an economics term there, maximum usable output. But our goal with anything in research, whether it be an interview, whether it be questionnaires, whether it be observation, our goal with anything in research is to have a complete engagement with our respondent. So an interview that somebody says halfway through, "Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Craig, I can't finish this interview," is a 0 for us. We've spent time, they've spent time, but we can't use the materials because it's an incomplete process. So maximum usable output means we get the whole interview done, the best of our abilities. That gives us data that we can then code, we can analyze, ultimately we can use. So that's the goal. So when I talk about designing questions and discussion flow, it's not only what do you ask and how do you word those individual questions, but it's also how you build up your rapport with people, with the participants during that process, so that they are enjoying sharing information with you, or better yet, they're enjoying it so much they're actually willing to go above and beyond what your hopes or your expectations are. There's nothing worse than going through an interview with somebody and you ask a question, yes, no, no, yes, no. And they're not telling you a story. They're not giving you a narrative. That's a survey. Well, that's, a questionnaire. That's not a problem. But in an interview, you want that engagement. You need that engagement. Now, let's just sort of go through the introduction, the purpose of interviews. Interviews are really a qualitative method for gathering evidence, data, or information. It's qualitative because we're engaging with people, we're getting their stories, and more importantly, we're not only facilitating their voice, but through our own research and how we engage with their voice, we're also responsible for telling their story, in part or in whole, but we become responsible for sharing their story and their narrative. It's considered by some as rich, deep data. That really depends on who you read. But at the end of the day, it is very nuanced. It is very deep. and there is a lot more to it than perhaps you're going to get at a superficial level, which a survey will perhaps give you. It is designed to collect this rich, deep data about things such as attributes, behaviors, preferences, feelings, attitudes, opinions, knowledge. It is a deep dive into an aspect of something with somebody, but it gives them an opportunity to not only just say what it is, but also the why and how it impacts them. And it also gives an opportunity to explore future potential behavior. So the interview is a very multi-purpose technique, but it's a very valuable technique. Ultimately, interviews help us to explain, to better understand, to explore our subjects' opinions, behaviors, experiences, and phenomena. An interview is not always going to be the right methodology or the right approach for you. So you've got to take into account your overall objectives with your research. You've got to take into account the individuals that you are going to be engaging with, and making sure that interview is going to be the right way to get or to elucidate that data from them. Sometimes you might look at it and you realize, you know what, because of the type of individual I'm dealing with, interviews aren't quite right. I might be better with observational studies. I might be better with a focus group. And, you know, interviews and focus groups are tightly connected, but still uniquely enough differentiated. But you might realize that the voice of multiple people together is actually going to help get that rich, deep data more so than a one-on-one conversation with somebody. To me, the interview is an interpersonal encounter. And I say this because, look, you are communicating with another individual on a human level as an active participant. When we do a survey or questionnaire, we engage, but we're not really an active participant. We give them the survey, they fill it out, they send it back. We don't get that opportunity to probe. We don't get that opportunity to follow our intuition or our instinct and say, you know what, you just raised a really good point. Let me sort of diverge or segue off for a little while and explore what you just said, and then I'll come back to the main points or the main topic that I had in mind. So it is interpersonal. It is two ways. You're building on what they say, and as they develop trust and rapport with you, their answers are going to build on the experience that they have had and enable some growth there. Now, just a few points about this idea. It's about social skills. As an interviewer, we have to demonstrate empathy, warmth, attentiveness, humor where it is appropriate. And I'll let you read the room for that one. You know, if we're doing interviews in a hospital with terminal patients, probably humor is not going to be there. But if we're out in the community and we're perhaps you know, in a shopping mall, or perhaps we've even gone into an organization, humor might work. And it's about how we relate to individuals. And also consideration, just sort of allowing for other people to be maybe a little bit slow in their response, or allowing them to tell a long story. You know, you never want to go into an interview, you've asked a question, and the person starts telling a story, and you can never say to them, can you get to the point? Because that would be considered rude. But flip side of that is the concept of consideration. We're allowing for every individual that we are working with, we are engaging with, to have their own unique style, to have their own unique voice. And as interviewers, we need to respect that. But also, when we come to code and analyze later on, we're actually going to find that that contributes, additional data to help us. We've got to avoid having judgmental attitude, shock, or discomfort because it's immediately detected. You ask a question, somebody gives you an answer, you go, oh, really? That's just not going to work. That means not only have you given a judgment on that person, they may not want to tell you anything deeper or anything further because they feel that you've judged them. But at the end of the day, you may have also introduced a bias because the way in which you respond to their answers may influence how they continue to answer the questions that you put to them. So it's very important that, if you've got a face like mine, Farrell will certainly tell you, if you have a face like mine, you can see what I'm thinking before my mouth opens. If you've got that, you've got to work on having that sort of poker face, but pulling back on any sort of judgment that goes to it. The next thing is never answer a question for the respondent. And this is really important. We're there to hear what they have to say. Sometimes it's easy for us, somebody's sort of trying to give an answer and they're like, I was looking at the thing the other day, the thing. And it's easy for the interviewer to say, you mean television? It's never appropriate for us to try and put words into the mouth of the people we are speaking to. Now, that's where consideration comes back to point, because we've just got to give them time. We've got to allocate that time so that they can remember the words they want. And if they can't, we can come back to that and say, let's move on, and we can come back to that in a few minutes, because people often remember when they move on to the next topic. It's like, oh yeah, I was talking about YouTube, and it comes back to them quite fast. So, never be in a position that you're answering for them because you want to see what they've got. We need to be completely engaged with them. And that's not a nice word, simultaneously keeping track of the questions one needs to ask. Now, the importance here is, look, as an interpersonal relationship that you're building, you don't want to look distracted. Imagine if, as I'm teaching this class, I'm just going to get on my phone and check out a few of the messages that I've got. I'll try and reply to a couple, and then I forget what question I'd ask you. That's just bad. The moment we're with our respondent, whether that be face-to-face in the same room, whether that be in an online setting like this, or even an online setting like WhatsApp video calls, for example, also very valid. But regardless of the setting, we've got to have their complete attention, and they deserve to have our complete attention. Now, that also means that we do have to keep track of the questions. And there'll be periods of time, depending on the person you're interviewing, but there'll be times that you start asking questions and you learn about them, and then you realize they might not be able to answer a particular question, or maybe a question might become sensitive to them, and you're like, oh, should I ask this? You have a job, and your job is to ask a particular, I guess, but either a particular set of questions or a particular set of themes, because not all of us write questions out. Some of us just write out themes, and we'll come to explore that shortly. But it is our responsibility to make sure that they're all covered. And that means that even if we're touching upon something sensitive, it's our personality and how we engage with them and how we get them on side that helps us to broach that question. It doesn't mean I have to go from question 1 to 10 in order. I might start in the middle and just sort of go around depending on the person. but I still need to make sure that I have covered each question. Even if I say, look, there's a sensitive question that I think might be out of your scope for the moment, but let me ask it and you give me your reaction. And if their reaction is, no, I can't answer that, it's fine. We have an answer. If their action is actually, yeah, I can talk about that for a few minutes, then you've got data as well. So you've done your job in that respect. We need to make sure, just like any conversation with individuals, that we're using active listening techniques. Now, I'm probably not going to be the best person for active listening, because anybody who works with me will probably tell you he's off in his own planet. But it's sort of simple things like repeating back answers to be able, so somebody's given you an answer, you just repeat back a bit of it to show that you're listening. But also maybe it's a clarification or something like, wow, tell me more about that. Maybe that's a little over the top because, yeah, the word wow kind of emphasizes a little bit more than some of us would want. But, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Or that's really interesting. All it is showcasing that you value their voice. And honestly, as a researcher conducting interviews with participants, we, more than anyone else, should be truly valuing the voice of our respondents, because that actually informs our research. So we're not going to be faking it. We've just got to remember to engage in ways that showcase that we're there. Never ever be afraid of silence, because you can use it to prod the respondent to reflect, to amplify an answer. Interviews are always going to be awkward. It's not like having a conversation with friends. There are always going to be moments where it's like, so, there's your chance to be able to say, is there any, is there any comments you'd like to make so far about how the interview's gone, or have have I missed anything you thought I would ask? Any opportunity to sort of just be able to not dig deeper, but just to poke the individual respondent to get a little bit more from it. My advice, again, as an interpersonal encounter, don't follow the interview guide. And the interview guide is usually your list of questions or themes or whatever that you have to talk about, but actually follow the respondent. At the end of the day, you've got to ask all those questions, or you've got to cover all those themes, but let the respondent guide the order in which you talk about those and the depth in which you talk about those. Follow up with anything that they suggest. So if there's some new information that they bring up, follow along that line. Yes, it is going down, following down the rabbit hole or something like that. It is going down a few extra rabbit holes. But at the end of the day, one, that builds rapport. That gets the respondent more comfortable with you. Two, chances are it's going to give you more nuanced data and additional data that will help you. And ultimately, you can always circle back to whatever else you needed to talk about. But it's easier to circle back when both parties are comfortable with each other than it is if you're sort of having a bit of a tense scenario. And we'll sort of, a bit later, I'll come to that. How do we deal with an individual who is very tense or very adamant in terms of not contributing perhaps as well as they could to the interview process? So we'll talk about that. The final part I talk about in terms of it as an interpersonal encounter is try not to think about time. So relax into the interview itself. Now, what I mean by this is, look, never go into an interview assuming that it's going to take half an hour or 60 minutes or whatever. it's going to take as long as it takes for you to ask, for them to tell their stories, and for everybody to be comfortable. Sometimes what you think will be a 30-minute interview can easily be 2 hours. And while this you might think, oh my God, I'm going over time, I've got the next one scheduled up, don't schedule interviews back to back. It's like any conversation with a friend. You can't say, well, you've got a 30-minute slot and then you have to go home. You have to let the interview take its course, which is about time. And if it's long, you've got two choices. One, you let it continue and hope that, both parties are comfortable with that. But if you're worried that the time is there, say, this is really a fantastic conversation. I haven't covered everything yet. Would you like to take a break, or would you like to schedule a follow-up where we can spend some more time? So, if you're limited on time, you can actually break the interview into two parts and do a follow-up further down with that. Now, to me, there are some major challenges with interviews. And this is something, as researchers, we have to learn to deal with. And some of these are practical, some of these are a little bit more specific to circumstances. But I tell you what, I've come across every single challenge in my career as an academic. We have to deal with gatekeepers and accessibility to the individuals. Now, depending on... Sorry, can I just ask that person to mute, please? Fantastic, thank you. Depending on who you are... Sanders, can I just ask you to mute your microphone, please? Thank you. So depending on who you are interviewing, depending on perhaps their role in the organization or whatever, there are going to be gatekeepers. It might be easy to convince your potential respondent to be able to do an interview with you. It might be harder to convince their secretary or their PA, personal assistant, that you deserve time on their calendar. And quite often, if you're dealing with senior people, and that will be the third one, but let's, look at it for a moment. If you're dealing with people of responsibility within an organization, the gatekeeper, their PA, their secretary, their receptionist, whatever terminology, is going to be the one that determines your access. So it's not only convincing the respondent to be involved, it's actually making nice with the gatekeepers so that they also say to their bosses, hey, I got a call from, Dr. Craig, a researcher. He's wanting to do an interview with you. I think it's a good idea. You want that endorsement from them. Now, many of us think we just email off to the person and we get a time. But sometimes we have to go through different levels of different challenges. Even finding contact details for some people is going to be very, very difficult. Availability is another one. We have got to schedule any interviews around the availability of the respondent. This is not about, well, I'm free tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Are you coming to do my interview? It's not about that. It's not like a job interview where you get to be able to say, well, you can come for the interview at, at 4 o'clock on a Thursday. You've got to be incredibly flexible. And that means, depending on your culture, but that might mean doing interviews with people at 11 o'clock at night. And, we've done things like that. Farrell and I, in our business, in our other business, when we've done interviews and discussions, we've had people that have said, look, 10 o'clock at night at this mummock stall or at this food place. And because that's the availability, we run with that, we go with that. And that's very valuable. Now, there is a difference between how we interview somebody at, say, CEO level versus rank and file, which is sort of, the everybody below effectively. It's a difference in mindset. dealing with a CEO, you need to come in, or a senior person within the organization. You need to come in already having a lot of knowledge. You need to showcase that you have done your research in advance. That means the questions you are asking are more compact. And what I mean by more compact is, look, do not ask them something that you could have got in advance from public information or from their secretaries or PAs. If it's basic information, you don't need it confirmed. You want to focus on the key issues at hand. When you're dealing with other people who are perhaps a little bit more community oriented, not so senior in an organization and so forth, there's a little bit more leeway to ask those questions and get some of the answers. But as a researcher, it's always going to be your job. Show that you've done the research first. Ask questions that you cannot get an answer from public sources. Then it's good. Then we have to look at permission to speak. Say, for example, I'm going to do some research at one of your universities. I want to talk to some early career academics within the arts and social sciences faculty. I can't just email or phone up to who I think I've identified as right and just say, I want to have a chit chat with you. I need to make sure that they have got organizational permission to speak and to represent on behalf of the university. Now, there's a bit of a fine line here, because if I'm asking them about their research expertise, it's already granted. If I'm asking them about their experience as an early career academic in that university, then it's going to need permission. Now, let's go into any organization. Let's go into a non-governmental organization, for example. In order for me to ensure that I'm getting the right information and I'm getting proper representation from the individuals, I need to know that they are authorized to speak on behalf of the organization. It's an organizational opinion or it is a personal opinion. So it is important for us to clarify some of these issues. And there might be a time we go through our ethics. We are able to talk and interview people, which is fantastic. And we get a fantastic interview with a mid-level staff within an organization. We start our coding, we're about ready to analyze, and the CEO sends us an email and says, this person is not permitted to speak or represent the organization. We request that you withdraw their narrative from your research. We have to adhere to that. We have to follow that. So it's always important to make sure that they are allowed to be representative of the organization and that that internal permission has been communicated to you in some format. We have to think about our location, the channel. So are we doing an email interview? Yes, email interviews exist. Honestly, they suck because you're not getting that interaction, but they are better than not having an interview at all. And to me, what I think about is an email interview is a great follow-up. Say, for example, I've managed to spend 20 minutes with Farrell, busy CEO, I know I can't get more, but what I do is say, look, I've got a few extra questions, can I email them to you? And then, a couple of weeks later, I get my email responses. They still have value and there's still a way of collecting data. What they lack is the opportunity to probe too much. But an email interview is still going to be useful, especially for people who are either low tech or low access to tech. We have online interviews. That's like a Zoom. It can be WhatsApp is a fantastic tool nowadays for research because we have videos, we have messaging, we have different interactions, including group interactions, by the way, but we have different interactions that we can use WhatsApp and other messaging platforms. I think, what is it? Telegram, even Messenger or whatever it is from Facebook is a valid channel to be able to conduct our research on. We have telephone, which is pretty common. The challenge, I mean, nowadays it's easier. We can record telephone conversations much easier, but it hasn't always been the case. And of course, there's face-to-face. My encouragement is, look, face-to-face is the priority, online is the second, telephone is the third, email is the last. It's still data. We have to focus on the time and duration. What I said before is, look, an interview is going to take as long as it takes. That's important for us. What we've got to do in our planning stages is say, you know what, I've got an hour's worth of questions here. Being realistic, how many hours should I allocate for this? So I'm not going to, have back-to-back interviews because I don't want to rush my respondents. I'm going to simply say, okay, I'm setting aside 2 hours for this. If at an hour and a half, we know we're not anywhere near complete, that's our chance to say, this is a really productive interview. What I'd like to be able to do, because I know that, we've both got other commitments today. Could we schedule a follow-up interview and do that? So that's part of planning. We have to think about language. Language is always going to be very important. We're in here tonight talking in English. Let's go out into the community. Are we always going to be speaking in English? Is English even our respective first language? I live in Malaysia, and there are 4 to 5 very common popular languages out in the community, but there's actually a lot more. What we often experience is the idea of code switching, where you'll communicate with somebody and they'll switch between 2 or 3 languages in a sentence, and it's very easy to do. It's about making sure that you have access to understanding those languages. Now, let's assume, when I did my master's degree, the people I wanted to talk to did not have English as their first language. In fact, many of the people that were valuable to what I was trying to achieve actually spoke Mandarin. And the easiest thing was to have a translator. Or an alternative, nobody said you have to be the interviewer. Might be easier knowing that your respondents are a different category, different language set to you. Getting another person who's native fluency in that language, training them to do an interview, letting them do that, and then coming back to you with it. Now that applies, maybe if we're doing research with children. Say, for example, I'm going to do some research on children's experience in the urban playground, and I'm looking at 5 to 8-year-olds. Let's be honest, I hate children. I'm not good with them. I can't sit down and have a conversation with a child, and a child's not going to want to sit down and have an academic conversation with me. So I'm going to find somebody else who's comfortable with kids, who I can share with what I need to get out of this, who can then go and talk to kids at their level in their language. And that's very important. So the rule here is not about us having to develop a new skill. I don't particularly want to develop a skill to talk to 5-year-olds. The idea here is, look, if you don't have that skill, bring somebody on board for that task that you can trust, that can do it well. And then that's legitimate, it's ethical, and I promise you it saves so much stress of trying to, work with people who perhaps aren't going to be able to communicate with you as effectively as you would want from their voice, because translation can always happen. But it can always happen afterwards as well. We want to understand nuanced meaning. That is really about making sure that we really do understand what the individual says. So even if we're dealing in native language for ourselves and our respondents being identical, we've got to know that we can really understand everything that they say, which might mean making sure that you clarify. Maybe they're using terminology that's a bit different, or popular culture words that you don't quite understand. It's your job to make sure you get a full understanding of that. Making sure you prepare your interviewee. And that's one of the challenges, because it's easy for us to be prepared, but if we don't tell them, or we don't sort of give them a bit of a heads up or a guide as to what we're trying to do, what we want to achieve, how we want to achieve it, it may restrict the types of responses we're getting from them. And the final one is protocol. So business research versus consumer versus social research. The different protocols of a social setting. Now, for example, as a researcher going into a corporate office, I'm probably not going to go in dressed how I am. For social research, for consumer research, sure. But there are protocols of behavior. And it's our job as a researcher to follow the protocols of behavior established by the respondent. It is not our job to set those. We have to fit into their environment first in order to do our research. Let's just for a moment talk about ethics of interviewing, because ethics comes into everything as a researcher. We need to make sure that we get from our respondent informed consent. We need to offer our respondent a right of withdrawal. And this is the part that really is so stressful for researchers, because imagine we've done a fantastic interview with them. We've started our transcription and everything, and we're about to start coding, and they send you a message and they say, I've changed my mind. They don't have to give a reason. There's not a time limit on that, other than if you set one, which is highly recommended, by the way. But they have a right to withdraw. Even in the middle of an interview, imagine 45 minutes into what hopefully will be an hour's interview, they say, you know what, I'm just not getting this. I think I bow out. Thanks for the coffee and bye. And they go. We cannot use any of their data. Now, that's a big problem for us. The only value we get out of that data is in terms of shaping future questions or reflecting on it to try and figure out, did we as a researcher, did we do something that offended them? Did we do something that made them uncomfortable, or so forth? So that's sort of something we have to think about. We have to look at respecting confidentiality. And that's about who gets to know who the person is. Are we using their name in our research, in our write-up? Or are we using pseudonyms? If we're using pseudonyms, are we letting them choose? And, sort of Farrell chooses to become Fred, for example. Or are we using more simplistic R1, respondent 1, R2, respondent 2, R3, and so forth? Confidentiality is really important because they may tell us something that is commercially sensitive. They may share with us things that they don't necessarily want other people to know that they've said, which means a pseudonym might cover that quite comfortably. But at the end of the day, it's also about, I guess, the transparency in what we're doing as well. If we tell somebody that, we will not assign their name to their comments in the write-up that goes public, i.e. the dissertation or perhaps a journal article or so forth, then we have to follow by that. Now that links us to the fifth one, which is identification. So the two are intertwined there. Storage of transcripts. Every university has a policy. If you do interviews, you've got to store the transcripts in a university facility for X number of years. When I started my academic career at Auckland University, the interviews that we did for the things that we were involved with back at the time, we had to store on campus for 9 years. What's really ironic about this is nobody ever wanted to see them. We just had a filing cabinet in our office, which was for all of that. Nowadays, it's more likely to be on the cloud, or it's going to be in some sort of data repository. But it is about following your university expectations. My suggestion to you, though, even if your university says, you know what, you only need to store these transcripts for a year. 2 or 3 years later, you may still want to engage with those interviews for other research, and it may help you. So I would suggest keeping it a little bit longer. And that's the further use of transcripts and information obtained. Typically, when we do an interview with somebody, say I'm interviewing you tonight, part of my written information will be the use of this transcript will be for the production of a PhD dissertation by Dr. Craig on topic X. If I want to use it for publishing, say, for example, I want to write a journal article, I need to put that up front. So before you do an interview, you've got to decide what are your likely outputs that this data will contribute to. So it might be this interview is primarily for the purpose of a doctoral dissertation by Dr. Craig, but may also extend to journal article publications. So you're just covering your base, but you're also informed consent because the person, the respondent, can see, they're going to be used for a dissertation and they're going to be used for a journal article or a couple of journal articles. So they know where it's going to go. If you then subsequently go and do a town hall meeting with a set of politicians and you use this information, then you've breached the ethics. So you have to be very cautious about where you expect it to be used. Access to research output, that is about giving your respondents the opportunity to view or to have access to what you've done. So when I started at university, I was a respondent for somebody who was doing research on first-year university experiences and the challenges that they had. So that was really good. I got 2 types of research output. First, every transcript of our meeting was given to me to go through and to make any changes or clarifications if I felt they were necessary. Second, I was given a copy of the dissertation when it was finalized, so that, I had a copy of what I had contributed my voice to. Now, that's not to say that you have to give transcripts or you have to give dissertation copies. You might decide, I'm going to do a briefing document, and it might just be a 4 or 5 page summary of key findings. But what are you going to give to the person, to your respondents, to those who helped you? And finally, emotional support options during and after. Now, if I'm doing a bit of business research on understanding, strategic direction for a company, probably the CEO does not need emotional support. But if I'm talking about sensitive issues, I'm talking about childhood trauma, I'm talking about relationships, I'm talking about any number of things, making sure that there is access to counseling or support both during the interview and after the interview is important. Now, as a university, each one of us who is enrolled at our university, we should find that the university has counseling services, or they have access to counseling services, or the community has access to counseling services. Your responsibility is saying to a person, hey, Farrell, we're doing this interview. We might touch upon sensitive issues. If you find that you need emotional support or counseling afterwards, here's 3 recommended places that you can go to. So it's simply about making the options available. Nobody said you have to pay for it, but it is your responsibility to showcase that there are options available there so the participants can get into that. Now, I've talked a lot about the framework for interviews, how, what we have to do, what we have to think about, the ethical issues. Let's get into the types of interviews, because that's kind of what we're here for tonight. Now, I'm going to sort of rush through this one, and there's actually 3 types, but I'm going to rush through this one because a standardized or structured interview, to me, has a lot of parallels to a questionnaire or a survey. It's very, very rigid. It makes it easy to code. It's great for large samples. It's easy to replicate, all of this. But basically, it could also be replaced with a survey. So let's move into the 2 that are useful, and the 2 that we are most, the 2 that we are most likely to engage with in our approach. First is a semi-structured interview, and I term this as a guided conversation. We prepare questions in advance, easy for us as the researcher. We remain flexible, but we retain those guidelines. So we make sure that we're addressing everything in there, but we have a bit of flexibility to follow the individuals. It also means that we can express our questions in a format that we prefer. So word use, questioning approach. If I feel that your language capability maybe isn't the same as my questions, I may change the words I use for the question to make sure I get the answer from you. I may adjust it up or down to your level according to what I experience. There is a flexible structure. Now, ultimately, what I'm doing here is I've got my questions in advance, and I'm just massaging, slightly realigning those questions as I need to, and adding a couple in here as I need to. The disadvantage, though, is participants may question the reliability due to flexibility. Now, that would be quantitative participants who are saying this should have been a survey, more than anything. But, they might say, well, everybody got asked different questions. No, everybody got asked similar questions. What does become challenging for us as a researcher is that comparing our answers becomes difficult. So because no 2 questions had the same structure, it actually makes it harder to compare and infer results, because the question asked was a little bit different, i.e. the perspective of each answer may be a little bit different. Now, this to me is where we start to get that deep, rich data I talked about before, because at the end of the day, natural conversation is always going to be different depending on who we talk to. Most of us, especially those of us who are new to the research game, who are new to undertaking research at, say, a postgraduate level, most of us will engage with a semi-structured interview. It gives us enough of a framework to hang off, and it gives us enough of a consistency that we can try and make comparisons. It says no 2 questions are the same, the answer becomes difficult, but not impossible. So it gives a good structure. The more experienced you get, you're going to probably move towards unstructured interviews. And these are in-depth. They are termed conversations with a purpose. Now, any one of us in the room Doesn't matter how fresh we are to the research experience. We all have the ability to do this. It's just whether we have the comfort, the personal comfort level to do this as perhaps one of our first ever, serious attempts at interview-based research. They have the least number of questions. It's really free flow. And my approach to this is I don't have questions. I have a list of themes that I must discuss, and I just let the conversation take its course. But every so often, I pull the conversation back in to make sure I'm addressing the next theme. The real purpose here is we want to build a bond with our respondents. We want to elicit information. We want them to talk. So ultimately, by being the least structured that we possibly can be, we're actually developing a communication style with our respondents. We're getting them to trust us. And at the same time, we're trusting their answers. Trust is a two-way street in an interview. It's not just the respondent trusts us asking questions. We have to trust them that they're telling us their reality. And I say their reality versus the truth because everybody's perspective is different and we're giving them voice. But we want them to share how they see reality, their answers, rather than facts, perhaps. It needs a skilled researcher or interviewer to ensure that the parameters are not exceeded. The challenge with this is you can get so off track that you actually miss a significant chunk or key things that you really did want to talk about. Or worse than that, you get so, I guess, embedded in the process that the respondent takes over and dominates the experience. Now, often when we talk about focus groups, we have to worry about one or two people in the focus group dominating the experience. And that requires a certain set of skills or tools as the researcher to try and navigate and manage that. The same thing can happen in a one-on-one interview where you as the interviewer lose control and the respondent is actually guiding the research. Now that's, again, you have got to learn, or you've got to A, notice when it happens, and B, have a plan of attack to reel that person back in and continue where you're going. So on one hand, it's nice to have that free flow approach, but on the other hand, you don't want it to be detrimental to the purpose of the interview that you're doing. There's some advantages. Rapport is easy to develop, to bank on, and we bank on it in the sense that, look, when we've developed a really good rapport with individuals, they're going to talk to us more. If we ask something that they're a bit uncomfortable with, that rapport that's been built up will help them to say, you know what, I'm going to answer that question. I feel comfortable with answering that particular question. It gives participants an opportunity to better explain answers or gray areas. So, you're partway through a conversation, they say something and you're like, you know what, let's scrap that from what I'm doing. I want to say it a different way. I think I haven't got there with it, or I think it may be misinterpreted the wrong way. All of this. So it's an advantage for us. It gives us the flexibility to explore and to detract. That also, comes down to discomfort, and you start to recognize where some of the individual respondents are like, okay, they're pressing too far on an area, and you can just sort of step back a bit and keep going, and like a natural conversation with friends. The disadvantages, though, are, look, duration and time. An unstructured interview will go on for longer and longer, but this is your responsibility as a researcher to prepare for that. You've just simply got to be ready. Reliability is questionable again because you can't compare to others. Now, if we want pure reliability, we're probably doing quantitative research anyway. The whole idea of having narratives, of getting individuals' voices, is to hear those unique experiences. We can't always compare apples to apples. Sometimes an apple has to be compared to a peach or to a banana. But our job as a researcher is to weave that together in a narrative that talks about it all. So that becomes very important. The final one is ethics issues can sometimes be problematic. And it's really comes down to, it's not really the ethic, if I go back here, sorry, the ethics issues are not really so much of this other than the emotional support. That's going to be a key one in a very unstructured interview. And the right of withdrawal is also going to be a key issue. The other key issue that you will find is depending on how you've chosen to record or monitor the interview itself. An unstructured interview is going to take a lot more time in transcribing. However, the last couple of years, we have AI to do stuff like that. You still have to check on AI. You're still going to make sure that it's 100% accurate. So you listen to the interview again and you check against it. That's going to be something that we have to be able to consider, because you want to make sure that you've got a very accurate record of what is said. Now, the types of topics and questions, let's sort of move away from the type of interview. Let's talk about questions now. And I've touched upon this earlier, so I'll quickly go through this and move on. But the types of topics and questions are behaviors, opinions, values, feelings, knowledge, sensory, background, and demographic. These are typical question topics that we'll have, and they're going to be different for each one of us. And I'm only going to touch on demographics for a moment. Imagine each one of us is doing a series of interviews. Some of us in our demographic section may want gender. This is a whole question of challenge for us, because are there two genders or are there more genders? And depending on the culture in which you are doing your research, you may find that you have to adjust your flexibility here. So, for example, somebody based in Bangladesh currently, for example, is probably more likely to have the idea that, look, there are two genders, male and female, but they're going to do research in the United States. They're going to have to adjust their thinking to accommodate for the respondents that are there. So, there's going to be differences. I don't need, in most of the stuff that I do, I don't need to understand about gender. I might need to understand about age. I might need to understand about education levels. I might be interested in income. All of these things, it's not going to be the same for everybody. And my honest advice here is, look, one, you don't need to ask somebody, generally speaking, what their gender is. But if you really don't know, ask them how they identify, get that down, that's fine. But it doesn't need to be a compulsory question. You don't always need to understand somebody's age. You don't necessarily have to ask that about them. Lots of different things, whether or not you need them, whether or not you need to ask them as well. As for all the others, you put those in, they're there. Let's do some guidelines to developing questions. Just give me a second, please. Some guidelines to developing questions. The best questions are those which elicit the longest answers from the respondent. Don't ask questions that can be answered with one word. Are you happy today? I mean, most likely you'll get a yes or a no, or you'll get somebody's life story. But if it can be answered with a yes or a no, or a maybe, It's not a good question. You have to be very thoughtful in your construction of questions. You want people to be able to say, why are you happy today? They can't say yes or no to that. They have to say, oh, it's been a good day. I got a promotion at work. I found $50 as I was walking to the car. My friends bought me free lunch, all sorts of things. The way I framed the question is giving me a proper answer. Don't ask questions that require your respondents to do your analysis for you. That's actually your job. Now, it's hard to give an example for this. But when you keep asking questions, why do you think it's like that? Actually, it's your job to build those bridges, but sometimes it's their job to give you the foundations for that bridge as well. Don't ask for hearsay or opinions on behalf of a group they are part of. So, for example, what do people around here think of X? Because you're not going to get anything interesting. Let's give an example. What do PhD students at your university think about the provost? Well, the only person you can realistically speak on behalf of is you. So the question should be, what do you think about your provost? From conversations with your friends and colleagues, do they have differing opinions? That's the only way I can really do that, because I can't ask you to be representative of 20 or 50 other people. Don't be afraid to ask embarrassing questions. If you don't ask, they won't tell. Now, this is where building that rapport comes in. We want to be in a situation, we want to be in a position whereby they trust us. So if I ask something that's embarrassing, they'll talk about it. I'm not going to suggest any embarrassing questions right now. I've got a few, but that might just embarrass everybody. So depending on what our context of our interview is, embarrassing questions are going to be different. It might go from a business research where we talk about experiences with particular organizations, or we talk about profitability levels, or we talk about maybe asking the experience of when somebody was terminated from their job. In a social setting, it might talk about sexuality, it might talk about gender, it might talk about health challenges, which can actually be embarrassing for a lot of people. So there's a wide range and it's contextual. My advice here is, look, you know you need it. Work it into the conversation. When you have to ask something that's embarrassing, say, look, I've got this question I want to ask you. It can be a touchy subject. It can be a challenging subject for some people. But I do need to ask. Are you happy for me to ask it out loud, or would you like me to hand you a card with the question pre-written on it? So if you're too embarrassed to ask it, have it pre-written on a card you can give to them, and they can just give you the answer. Now that sort of cuts a little bit of the communication barriers at times as well. Make sure that as you're developing your questions, you adjust the language of the interview according to the respondent. So, earlier I talked about the example of children versus professionals and so forth. Choosing how you frame the questions and how you scaffold or structure the questions one after another is going to be dependent upon the person or category of people that you are interviewing. And if you're interviewing children, it might be less questions, it might be more play, it will be easier language, and you might have to think about what words can I use with a child and what words can't I use. So for example, if you're asking a child about playtime, you're like, let me think. What phenomenon do you prefer when you are engaged in the playground? Versus what things do you like to play with? Same question, but at two very distinctive communication levels. So although this should be common sense, many of us fail to adequately research our participants in advance to make sure that we can do this to the best of our ability. Take care to word questions so that respondents are motivated to answer as completely and honestly as possible. We want them to give us an answer. And ask how questions rather than why questions, because you want to get the stories of process rather than an acceptable account of behavior. At the end of the day, you want to understand their thinking, which really is a process-oriented thing rather than I did it this way, and they tell you they did it this way because they think that's what you want to hear. So you sort of want to make sure you're trying to elicit as much from them. Do think about the logical flow, what topics should come first, what topics, follow naturally. And don't be afraid that, if you're interviewing 10 people, that your flow of questions changes between, because you might interview a couple of people and you might realize that their reaction to how that happens isn't that good. So you adjust, you flow. I give an example. I spent last night rewriting this workshop, this webinar. I've given it multiple times, not only for the third degree, but I've given it for universities. And on reflecting on all of that, I realized I wanted to change the order of how I did everything. And I have for tonight, and I feel it's much better. Now, the same applies to conducting interviews. We do a round or two. We look back on and say, you know what? This question should really be asked earlier on, or this question should be asked later on. So it is important to, for us to reflect, and it's perfectly acceptable to make those changes as we progress. Now, having said that, I also say difficult or potentially embarrassing questions should be asked towards the end, mainly because rapport has been established. But if you've got good rapport with somebody and it starts showing early on, it's also okay to weave them in as you're there. The last question of any interview needs to provide some closure to that interview, and ultimately to provide closure for the respondent. Let them leave, let the respondent leave feeling empowered, listening to, and hopefully glad that they talked to you. Now that's a challenging one, but this is about you giving them the last say. The last question you ask should not be for them to answer. The last question you ask should be giving them an opportunity to tell you anything else that they want to share, that they feel is relevant, that maybe you've missed out on. Now, in terms of the kinds of questions that we have, again, I'm going to go through this reasonably fast. I think they're important, they're self-explanatory in many ways, okay? But it is good to, be able to think about a few of them. So you have introduction questions, which is just, why did you do like this? Or can you tell me about? They're just sort of trying to warm people up. You have follow-up questions. You have probing questions. And a probing question is trying to get more out of somebody's discussion. So look, are there some examples you could share? Could you say a little bit more about this? A probing question is much like trying to get information from ChatGPT. You word it in such a way to try and get that extra little bit of information and hope that they provide you more. You have specifying questions, which really hones in on a particular aspect. And you'll find that these are good because as you're listening to your respondent, as you're getting their stories, as you're getting their narratives, a specifying type question really allows you to zone in on one thing and say, well, tell me more about that. What happened next? What was the outcome of this? How did other people respond? So it is a very useful style. A direct question is really a question with yes or no. And earlier I said, do not ask questions that have a one-word answer. Once in a while, you need this so that your next question can springboard for it. Because if it's a yes answer, the question goes one way. If it's a no answer, of course, the question goes a different way. So sometimes yes. Indirect questions are to ask to get to the interviewee's true opinion. Structuring question is where you're sort of building, we've talked about this. Let's move on to the next layer of this. And you categorize the expectations of the answers as you progress. Now, silence as a question is also very good. If we use the concept of the pause, you can actually suggest to the interviewee that you want a little bit more of an answer from them. So if they've talked about an answer and you're like, and you don't move on to that next question, that awkward silence sometimes is enough for them to volunteer up a little bit more information that might be useful. And finally, we have interpreting questions. And this is really, I want to say for you guys as researchers, this is also clarification questions, because it's so do you mean that, or is it correct? It's an opportunity for you to make sure that you understood what they said, or give them an opportunity to clarify their answer so it's more articulate. The sequence of questions is the next consideration. And it's really, how do I go through? We want our respondents involved in that interview as soon as possible. So we want them sharing stories from the beginning. We want them talking. We want them being open. If we're going to talk about something controversial, such as feelings, conclusions, sometimes experience as well, first start with asking about facts and then get them to develop from that. You also want to make sure you don't overkill certain questions. So intersperse those fact-based questions throughout the interviews. Now, there's both overkill and anchor here. The anchor is like the first part. We want to set a foundation that we can talk about. But at the same time, we don't want to ask so many fact questions that it feels like they're doing a primary school test. So we don't want to give that experience. Always ask questions about the present before you focus on the past or potential future behavior. So ground it in today and then ground it in history or in tomorrow. Now, the last question should always allow a respondent to provide other information that they wish to add. Also ask them their impressions of the interview. Again, asking about impressions of their interview is giving them a bit more voice. It's not only saying, what else do you want to add, but it's, is there anything you particularly enjoyed about the interview? Is there anything that you felt uncomfortable about? We are not likely, well, most of us, we are not likely to be using that particular question in our analysis, but it does help us create better or stronger interview experiences for others as we progress as well. It also, as we finish up an interview, it gives, how am I going to put this? It gives the respondents a feeling of empowerment that they've shaped what your future is in terms of, future or subsequent interviews. But it also gave them a voice, not on the subject matter of the interview, but it gave them a voice in the overall interview experience. And that's actually a very powerful thing to enable with that process. Now, obtaining adequate response, and I'm just talking about the probe. Sometimes we get people who give short answers and we've just got to push them that little bit extra. And I talked about silence as a probe. The silent probe is just sitting there and hoping that they'll say something else because, you're expecting something else. Overt encouragement is, that's fantastic. Can you tell me more? I personally don't like that. That sounds so fake. But if you're working with kids, it could be a really good thing. It can be great with others too. Elaboration, which is just trying to encourage them to explain in more detail. Can you elaborate further? Can you tell me a bit more about this or how it made you feel, etc., etc. We have asking for clarification. And it's perfectly fine as a researcher to look like you didn't understand something. So say, I want to check that this is your meaning. I want to fully understand what you said here. Communication is always a two-way street. Sometimes it's going to be hard for them to express something. Sometimes it might be a word choice thing. If they're comfortable with you, they'll answer it. And the last one, in terms of a probe is repetition. Oh, so you've just said that A and B were related to C. Is that correct? Now that's a clarification. It's also a repetition because you're going back to exactly what they've said, and it's giving them an opportunity to either go a little bit more or to add on to that, or simply just to confirm. Now, I kind of want to wrap up in a few minutes, so this is my cue for Farrell for a Q&A session, but I want to do a bit of practical advice. One, never finish your respondent's sentences for them. Always let them give the answer that they want to say. That may create some fantastic coding challenges for you, but at the end of the day, our responsibility as a researcher is to work with what they tell us, not what we tell them. Secondly, always attempt to remain as neutral as possible. So try not to overly agree, try not to look shocked or surprised, try not to look overtly happy. Our job is really to sit on that fence and let them tell the story, because our judgment comes when we write our chapter 4 and our chapter 5, when we do our analysis and we draw our conclusions. That's where we get to put our judgment. We put our understanding of their experience, not during the interview itself. Now, this one's sort of a bit old-fashioned, but be careful about appearance when note-taking. And I will still take notes during an interview because I'm not trying to record exact moments. I'm either recording a time so I can come back to the recording that I've done, or I'm sort of highlighting a few key words that resonated with me and I want to come back to it. But don't sort of sit there with your notepad and they say something like, ooh, and write it down. You don't want to look so obvious. And if you're making a shopping list while they're talking, you don't want them to think that their shopping list is a reaction to what they've said. You want to make sure that the note-taking is a very passive and unobtrusive experience for your respondent. And the last one, which I did talk about before, don't lose control of the interview. You, as a researcher, have got to develop skills to handle a difficult respondent. Now, that's not something I can go into detail with tonight. It's something I do spend a lot more time with in the boot camps. But it takes a bit longer to talk about it. Whatever happens, make sure you have some tools available to you to regain control. If the respondent talks too much, have some established tools. Practice those established tools in advance with somebody, maybe your supervisor, maybe somebody else from your cohort in your PhD program. but practice those as well, so that should the situation arise, you're able to handle it without losing that respondent. Because again, everything comes down to that maximum usable output. Even a difficult respondent, we want to use their words. They're valuable to our data collection. Plus, we've all spent time on it, so we've got to be sure about that. Now, immediately after an interview, this is something that's really worth doing. Check the recording, listen to check that nothing's missing, store it safely. Not a combination of words I could get out then. But if you don't have the recording, say, for example, your technology failed, and this has happened to me, the technology failed, what can I do? I'm not asking the person to do it again. What I'm immediately doing is taking my notebook and writing down everything that I feel was significant, because I can still use that. It's not as good as a recording. It's certainly not as good as having that transcript. But before, in the days before recordings happened, when we just used to use pen and paper was good enough. So if something's gone wrong with your equipment, then be able to make those notes straight away. Now, as an advice, don't go into an interview with one phone to record. Take two. Always have a backup, because things happen, and you've just got to have that preparedness. Make any notes on your written notes. So actually, what's really great is, I said I take notes during the interview. I circle back to those notes once my respondent has moved or gone, and I put in a different color pen. I pick out the good old-fashioned teacher's red pen. I put in a different color pen my reactions or my thoughts or my gut instinct or links to anything else they said. It's just a reflection. And that will help you later on. If you've got transcripts, great, because then you're going to pay more attention to certain things and try to understand those linkages. If you're doing it any other way, you've got those notes. The notes themselves have got to be not only a record of things that have been said, but it is also a record of your reaction and your reflection to those. And that kind of segues into the last one. Write down any observations made during the interview. So typically what I do during an interview is not so much on what's said. I write down key keywords or key ideas or key timings of when something was said. I make more comments about body language. Again, this is a reflection, but it's an observation. The body language didn't seem to match with what was being said, or the body language seemed anxious or something like that. So I actually make down observations that I think are valuable like that. That gives me a chance to, when I go back to the transcript, just listen for sincerity in the voice, listen for tonality of how something is said. So that's one great thing. But it gives me a triangulation tool, because now I'm going to look to see, are other people at similar times also uncomfortable? And if they are, then of course, that gives me another level of analysis to look at. Now, I think this is my final one. Yeah, it is my final slide, so it's almost over to you. Should I record and transcribe? The more I go into this, I'm just going to say yes. Forget the pros and cons. But let's go through those. I personally believe recording is very important, but not everybody's going to give that permission to you, so be aware of that. If you're recording it, you definitely are going to transcribe it. That doesn't mean hours and hours of sitting, listening to segments and typing them out. We have AI now, and we have a lot of free AI that's available that you can just play, send a file to, it will take it, put it out there in a Word document. You still have to go through and just check that it's 100%, but that's so much easier than spending hours and hours. My students, I taught a master's degree class a few months back, and my students only had to interview one person each, a 15-minute interview. And my students are wonderful people, but some of them do not like technology. Some of them spent 8 hours transcribing a 15-minute interview. Others spent 1 minute using AI and then half an hour checking the AI was correct. Choose what you're comfortable with, but know that there are tools out there. And using AI to transcribe your interviews is ethically acceptable, as long as you are checking that the transcription the AI produces for you matches the words and adjusting them in case they're not. Now, let's just go the pros and cons really quickly before I go into Q&A. It helps correct natural limitations of our memory. Most of us would struggle to remember a 15-minute interview, let alone something longer. It's always good to have that backup. It's always good to have the level of accuracy that a recording and a transcription offers. It allows us a much more thorough examination and repeated examination of the answers. If I'm just listening to you taking notes, I'm putting down my instant reaction. I can't go back and replay that so well in my mind to say, you know what, there was a nuance in there that I missed, but I can do that with the transcription or with the recording. It opens up the data to public scrutiny. Now, on one side, we have the ethics concern about confidentiality and all of that, but also part of research is replicability, that our supervisor, for example, can take our transcriptions and look through them and say, you know what, I agree with the analysis, or I would have done it a different way. It also helps counter accusations that our analysis might have been influenced by our own values and biases. So selective listening, for example, in an interview, I'm going to hear certain things and I'm not going to hear anything that I disagree with. Therefore, I'm only going to write about things I agree with. That's not a representation of what was spoken during that interview. It also allows data to be reused in other ways from those intended. For example, in light of new theoretical ideas or analytical strategies 1 or 2 years later. Now, remember before I said part of informed consent is about the respondent knowing that this is going to be used for a dissertation and or a journal publication and or something else. So there's always going to be new ways we can use the data. Even 6 months down the track, there will be a new way. Make sure your informed consent is open enough to facilitate that as being an option. The disadvantages, it introduces a different dynamic into the social encounter of the interview. The moment somebody thinks or knows they're being recorded, let's say the moment somebody knows they're being recorded, they behave differently. But then again, that's your job as a researcher to build that rapport, to build that dynamic, to make them feel comfortable so that they forget they're being recorded. Now, let's be honest, it's 2024. Most people are used to living in some form of surveillance. So it's not really such a big thing as, say, compared to 10, 15 years ago, or even, even way further back to when I started my career in the 90s. But different people react different ways. Having a video camera or having the phone on the coffee table in front of you recording is how to say it, can sometimes be off-putting. Maybe you just, you tell them, I'm going to record, you put the recording in a soft bag and they never see it. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind, that might help the dynamics. Transcribing is really a time-consuming process, so it does require good quality equipment AI makes it a lot better. The last 2 years with AI, it's fantastic. And, you can go for a free software such as Otter.ai. I think is one of the ones I've used in the past. It's got about a 90% accuracy rate, not so bad. Zoom has its own AI and produces transcriptions these days. Again, it's only about 90%, but it significantly reduces the time that you will have to spend as a researcher going through word by word. You can go through, listen, and read the transcript, say, oh, whoops, change that word. Done. Easy. So my advice is always use AI. When you're writing up about your methodology, when you're writing up, you have to have a section that explains how you did the recording. So recordings were done on my iPhone 112, whatever it's up to now, and transcribed using Otter.ai. Done. That's it. But at least you've got that transparency in there as well.